Ahoy! The New World Season of Divide artifacts have been revealed further with detailed information on what kind of perks it will actually have, and these are quite interesting and I think will be quite impactful for various playstyles, more than I expected based on the stats that they have. So let's look at them. We're starting with Old Crown, a medium headpiece, so this can be used in light gear if you want to. And in my opinion, this will kind of replace the tuned leather pants unless I'm missing something very crucial, because the base perk already is Royal plus 10 to all attributes, and if we look at the tuned leather pants, that is the base perk here, the well-rounded perk. Of course it goes up a little bit, but I'm assuming that in this case we're also looking at the 700 gear score version. Maybe otherwise it'll have slightly less attributes, but it has way more that I think makes it more effective. We're actually going to start with two of the gems here that are more straightforward. We have the Immaculate Onyx with 3% physical absorption and the Immaculate Opal with 3% elemental absorption. So these are already stronger than your default gems, sitting at 2.5%. But then on top of that, there is a third gem slot. It does specifically say triple gems here, which is Energizing Spectral Ward. This is probably meant to say Energized Spectral Ward, in which case it would be this particular gem here, coming in with another 1.5% elemental and 0.5 physical damage absorption on top of the 3% of each that we already have, and then coming with +1 stamina on hit. In total, this would basically just be 3 gems in terms of total absorption, because this is slightly less than a normal gem, and then the other ones are slightly more. So overall, if we look at the Onyx here, for example, with the 2.5% and then these values here, all in all, this would end up just being like 3 full-on normal mitigation gems, and then on top of that you still get the energizing effect, unless they are somehow mislabeling this and it doesn't actually have the spectral ward effect as it sounds like. But either way, this sounds extremely strong in terms of mitigation, so far that I think even without the attribute effects there might be reasons why this might be considered in some places. I think there would be certain other items that could be better if it comes to pure mitigation, but in combination with these attributes, which I think are very, very useful for many roles and are often underrated because the 25 capstones for attributes are very good. This is an extremely strong combination, and you can get this through the PvP reward track, so I think this will be fairly sought after. Of course, attuned leather pants are a lot easier to get in comparison, but with these stats it's great for both PvP and PvE, to be honest. Vampire's Vestments are a light chest. Now these are designed for mages and lifesteal build because they come with a trade-off basically. Hitting a target consumes 10 mana. If mana is spent this way, that hit grants 10% lifesteal. This probably means that if you have no mana, you won't get the lifesteal either, because it says if mana is spent this way. So if you're out of mana, you can't spend mana, then you probably aren't getting any lifesteal. And if using a magic weapon, this only gets triggered by abilities, while basic attacks restore 10 mana with an 0.5 seconds cooldown. Along with that you have a gem slot, and you can get this from the season reward track. Now the first obvious choice that everyone would go to here is of course Void Blade. I'm not entirely sure how this will work with Void Blade, because in some scenarios Void Blade is also labeled an ability. It could somehow trigger both conditions at the same time, but it probably will only trigger the basic attack one, at least after the initial activation, in which case you can just get your mana back by spamming Void Blade attacks and then use that to spam abilities, though the Void Blade can already do that pretty easily even without this artifact, so it might not even be necessary. And especially if you're going for a medium Void build, then you might be better off with the pants that directly increase your damage from the Gorgon's Raid. So I don't know if that's the best use case. That is definitely a use case where people will consider it. I'm sure there are other ones, but one that really stands out to me that I think isn't quite as obvious when you don't have that immediately on your mind is the Abyss, because the Abyss has the condition of dealing 15% more damage when mana is below 100%. And this means that something is finally possible that wasn't for a very long time. You can run the Abyss with another melee weapon, with a normal, well, not magical weapon, and you will be able to get the Abyss 15% damage increase, the additional effect from that, while sometimes, at least as long as you have mana, also getting the extra 10% lifesteal. And I think that is massive. I think that might be the primary use case in the long term, because it's such a strong combination, and I think Abyss combined with a physical weapon in general is very strong because it makes it very difficult to counter build as well. You can not really split your gems effectively unless you just go 50-50 Onyx Opal. Since, well, you're either taking more damage from Abyss or whatever physical weapon is on the other hand. And the trade-off is, of course, that you can't have another armor artifact, but I think for very aggressive builds, this could be worth it, and I think this could be very interesting. The Lich Glove description is a bit confusing, because it says, these gloves are perfect fit for spellcasters who love to stack power before unleashing a flurry of light attacks. To my understanding, that's not what's happening, because this would only apply for one light attack. So the effect here is Curse, activating an ability, grants 4% in power for 7 seconds. Fair enough. Stacks up to 3 times, so up to 12% total. All stacks are lost on basic attack, and you cannot gain new stacks for 5 seconds after losing them. Comes with a gem slot and from the season track. I'm not quite sure how this will be used very well, because I feel like most mage builds would still want to use basic attacks too often for this to be effective. Maybe some Ice Gauntlet combos could make this more impactful. I was also thinking maybe some melee weapons might actually benefit from this more. Maybe you do something like a Great Axe combo in a war, and then afterwards you drop the basic attack and you have some more damage for that, and then you kind of get out anyways. But at the same time, I don't know if that's something you'd really want to prioritize over other artifacts. So I think the empower value here is relatively low, with a relatively low stack cap overall, which is fine. I'd rather see it this way than the other way around. But that makes it a bit difficult to effectively place this and know where this would actually be particularly useful or strong to me personally. Maybe I'm overlooking a very obvious case where this is super effective. But yeah, like Fire Staff, Void Gauntlet, Ice Gauntlet, for the most part, use basic attacks still at some point, and therefore I feel like you lose the empower relatively quickly, and then you have a very long cooldown with the 5 seconds where you're not getting any new stacks afterwards. So you'd really have to kill someone in that very first burst. Runic Greaves, on the other hand, very interesting. When we initially had information about that, I was saying this could be really good, or it could be solid depending on how high the stats will be, how high the values will be, because otherwise it'll be outclassed by more effective defensive options. But the effect is expeditious. Activating a hard rune grants 33% move speed for 7 seconds with a gem slot once again, and available from the PvP reward track. Now 33% movement speed is a lot, and 7 seconds is also a lot. I want to put this in context with Accelerated Resolve. Accelerated Resolve, when you put it on your shield, which is already the strongest version of it, gives you 36% movement speed, and that is for 6 seconds. It also has the healing effect, but you can tell that in overall value this is very similar. Slightly higher percentage, slightly shorter duration. And if you've ever seen a tank run at you with Accelerated Resolve, they are really fast. And this is tied to activation of the hard rune here, and I think this could actually have significant value, particularly for people who are bombing in wars that are just running detonate, or also for certain more aggressive builds. But the problem with that is that you have to fit in heavy feet somehow. But I think there are quite a few playstyles where this could be beneficial. This is relatively conditional because hard rune activations are not that frequent compared to other effects. But if you have a build that gets hard rune effects often enough and you can utilize this well, I think there could be value in this. I don't think this is something that everyone will run, but I think specific roles could benefit from this fairly strongly. The next weapon is Chaos, a blunderbuss. This one is kind of one that's translated over from the previous seasonal server. This comes with Chaos Blast, which makes Blast Shot, not Aethos Shrapnel Blast, gain plus 300% push distance. The first target hit is ignited, becomes a projectile, dealing 50% weapon damage to all enemies they pass through, with a gem slot and found in the Outpost Rush rewards. Now I think that Blast Shot in particular is a bit of an annoying ability because it is a bit clunky in terms of how you aim it, and it's relatively easy for an enemy who's anticipating it to juke it, and then you're kind of just a sitting duck. Of course, if it's becoming more prevalent with this particular artifact, then people will be able to learn to juke it even more effectively. It also struggles a bit when someone has grit, of course. So that used to be a big problem, less of a problem now in comparison. But all in all, there is definitely room for this to be interesting. There's room for this to be useful. I think it's going to be a very fun weapon. And it's also potentially going to be a very interesting weapon for self-peel. I could imagine even people that normally build something completely different on their offhand using this to self-peel, because if you run this along with net shot, then you have a lot of ways to create very, very significant distance between you and any enemy you're fighting. So could be interesting how this actually ends up being used. Of course, that means they don't have a other choice or artifact in the main hand, but I could see this particularly for Lifestaff. Like, why not? You have that very strong push and you can shoot yourself far away. That just seems very handy. Wit is a longsword, and I initially thought that this could be useful for PvE and PvP, but they actually thought of that. So, first of all, the effect here, taunts are active, which I guess means that you don't need a Cornelian in this, because taunts are already active. That is kind of interesting. And then along with that, light attack critical hits generate 250% more threat. On crit, reduce hostile AI's base damage to you by 15% for 3 seconds. I think this is a very interesting approach. Again, not useful in PvP because it's hostile AI only, but first of all, apparently we have our taunts here, so gem slot slottable, we can add another slot. Or another gem for additional damage. And longswords already have a relatively high crit chance with the extra perk that's built in. Then you can of course build into keen on your, or keen awareness on your ring, and you can run a keen sword. I think you can also technically run a keen shield. I'm not sure if they stack. I think they don't, but I also haven't tested that in forever, so maybe they do now, who knows. Would have to look that up. But either way, there are quite a few ways in which you can get crit up, and if you build around it specifically, it could be that you're basically critting once every 3 seconds, especially if you're hitting multiple targets, meaning you can have constant uptime on this mitigation as long as you are spamming light attacks. And I think that's very interesting, because otherwise longsword, again, is still good, but sometimes falling a bit out of favor when it comes to tanking options, because other things are just more interesting in comparison. But with this, I think there's a very clear and interesting path. So I really like this, even though they made it unusable for PvP. Last but not least, there is Relentless, a tower shield that I'm sure will be somewhat controversial. Altruism. While in combat, nearby allies gain 35% armor. This is already very interesting, of course, for anyone really. It's effectively a 35% fortify. And you receive 20% increased incoming healing, excluding lifesteal and consumables, but in return your own armor is reduced by 20% with a gem slot found in mutation rewards. I believe that this is interesting both in PvP and in PvE. In PvE in particular, because you can do speed runs and give all of your squishy allies more armor. That's already going to be very impactful. In PvP, if you have this around a point or any control area, you're going to give all your bruisers significantly more armor. And on top of that, the 20% extra healing are also pretty big. I don't even think the 20% armor cut is that bad for a tower shield holder, because they usually have many ways of getting mitigations, reductions and whatnot, where armor is still a factor, of course, especially if it comes to fortify, so you're going to take more damage. But I don't think you're just going to be anywhere close to taking 20% more damage effectively, but rather in certain scenarios you will take, like, you will always take a bit more damage, but in certain scenarios you will take significantly more, but in many situations you will also just take a little bit more, whereas the 20% healing is just a consistent increase. Of course, this only works well if you have a healer. If you're running around solo, not much of a point to having this in general, because this is a buff for your allies. This requires you to have a healer, because it almost requires you to have a healer. There's some effects that are not affected, but since it doesn't affect lifesteal and consumables, and then this part is just a nerf to yourself. So this is just a team item through and through, but at that job, I think it'll be very, very good. It's also going to be interesting what happens if you have multiple. Do they give each other the armor, so effectively you have 15% extra armor instead of 35? I'm assuming not. I'm assuming that they have limited that, but who knows? So in general, definitely also a strong and interesting artifact. And I will say that overall, all of the artifacts here seem somewhat interesting and appealing and something that would have a use case somewhere, not quite equally, but to a degree where I'm like, okay, yeah, there will be someone trying this out and probably finding a way to apply this successfully, which has not always been the case for artifacts in the past, so I hope they keep on moving that direction. They are saying that in the future seasons they will release some less artifacts, and in return will rework some of the older ones to make them more viable. So it's going to be a split of new ones and reworked ones, and I hope they take similar approaches as they have done here. If you're interested in more videos, then consider subscribing and clicking the bell. And if you'd like to support me further, then you can do so on Patreon. Thanks to all of my patrons who already do exactly that, and thank you for watching. SLOTH, out.